Good evening and welcome to NewsMobile Big Question. Today we are talking about China, how to deal with China. As you know, in the wake of the Ladakh face-off, now China is under increased global scrutiny. We have a very distinguished panel lined up today. We have Mr. Jayadeva Ranade, who's a very noted China expert, has served in the research and analysis wing. We have Professor Amitabh Mattoo, a distinguished professor of international relations here at JNU and also in Melbourne. We have Probal Dasgupta, again strategic analyst, and has written a very landmark book, Watershed 1967. And we have Saurabh, my colleague, joining us today. To start off with you, Professor Mattoo, what do you think needs to be done now to deal with China, belligerent China, which is trying to bully countries like India and a lot of other democracies?
I think, Saurabh, if you're a scholar of international relations yourself, you know, in a situation like this, where there is a rising hegemonic power, and who happens to be a belligerent power and your neighbor, and with whom you have had differences on the border and other issues, you really have three choices. Either you try and balance that hegemonic power on your own, or you try and build a coalition with like-minded partners while retaining your autonomy, or you enter into an alliance with a stronger military power who can then balance China. I would say that India, given its history, given its track record, I don't think India will find it comfortable to become a satellite or an alliance partner of a superpower. What you need to do is engage China, and yet with like-minded powers which are being, as you put it, bullied by China, or which have a similar concern about a hegemonic belligerent China, build a relationship based on mutual interests, built on enhancing your defense capabilities so that you can try and balance China. It's not going to be easy, but that's the best hope that we can at least have in the foreseeable future to modulate China's behavior.
Right. Professor Mattoo, you touched upon some very interesting points that what could be like a multi-pronged strategy to take on China. But that brings me to the next question, and I would take it to Sri Ranade. I would want to ask you something, that when we are talking of engaging with China, when we are talking of aligning with like-minded partners in a way to take on China at different levels, what are the key factors that you think would tie us with a common thread when it comes to China? We have already seen that how Prime Minister Modi, during his Ladakh trip, has given out a message loud and clear, which has been heard very well by China, that the days of aggression, that the days of expansionism is gone. It's over. Now is the time to talk development, and India is capable of protecting its borders and ensuring that its sovereignty remains unchallenged. Sri Ranade.
Well, there are a number of factors that come in here to how we should look at it. The first point I would like to make is within the first 5 years of the founding of the People's Republic of China and India, we've been having differences, and differences which have been caused by a very aggressive posture by China. The degree of aggression, of course, has been dependent on China's economic and military might growing. So that is one point I would like to make, and we need to keep that at the back of our mind as and when, or as we try and balance China. I'm not using the word engage purposely. I'm saying balance China, because I think as we engage it, we have to be very conscious of its, if I may use the term, malevolent nature or malevolent disposition towards us. The causes for that are varied, but that is how it is. Third, I think as we move towards balancing China, we of course will have to maintain certain relationships with China. Some will be cooperative, some will be economic, but all those will have to be conditioned and managed through the prism of a hostile China, a hostile neighbor. I think the mistake we have made till now is we have been fairly open in our interactions with China, in allowing China access to our markets, and in increasing our dependence on China. China is not to blame for the latter, mind you, I agree, I concede. But we have not looked at China as a potentially hostile power.
Very, very important point that you made, Mr. Ranade. And I'll come to Probal now. Probal, how much are we to be blamed for this economic dependence, so to say? You know, you have a huge trade deficit with China. And how much of a pressure that was built upon China after the banning of these 59 apps? Because obviously a lot of Chinese companies are continuing to maintain are profiteering in India, and that needs to be stopped. So going ahead in the future, how can we use economic diplomacy as a leverage?
That's a good question, Saurabh. What happens is, this is a message. It's just a message about banning these apps. But I think going forward, the balancing that Mr. Ranade spoke about needs to be at various levels. Economic is one of them. When we're talking about economic balancing, we are also talking about creating a market that is a substitute or a semi-substitute in some form for the various global supply chains that are present in China as well. That's something that we need to look at, in a manner that addresses the larger strategic goals. It's not just about banning a few apps or looking at banning the Chinese companies here, but it's also about creating our base so that we are able to substitute whatever is there in China. And in that sense, when we are looking at the allies, and this is where the balancing comes in, and it has the economic part has to be in concert with the political and the military in some form. Why I say this is, when you're looking at Japanese, firms withdrawing from China, when you're looking at the various industrial bases being shifted out of China, and that's where India comes in, strengthening its own base and working with allies. Remember, this is a point of time in history where China stands isolated post-corona, and India has more allies in its bank than China. So in that sense, creating that market, creating the opportunities for a substitute market is one way to go forward, and is in one way to look at it in a more productive manner in terms of how we could combat or look at identifying newer economic gains out, so to say, out of the post-corona period. And that's where we'd be able to take on China, given that we have a huge market base, and it's also we need to look at India plus, which means India and the Southeast Asian markets. And that's where when I say in concert with the political and other geopolitical strategies, you have Southeast Asian countries who are in conflict with China over several issues. And I think given that fact, given Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, some of them are delivery bases, some of them are investors, I think an allied formation of that nature would help us in terms of our economic planning as far as China is concerned.
Right, Mr. Dasgupta, you touched upon this point, and carrying forward what Saurabh also said, that what is, when we are talking of leveraging it to our advantage from an economic perspective, when we talk of economy these days, the other threat that is looming large and where China has had a sizable presence is in the sphere of data. And data sovereignty has been an issue that has been talked about over and over again. Saurabh touched upon that issue of how 59 apps have now been banned by India. Mr. Ranade, I would like to take this question to you. I would want to ask you, like, if you look at China now, we're talking of a belligerent China. We're talking of a China which is, provoking India at the drop of a hat. Behind the scenes is a data war that the entire army is devoted, as it were. It's a new spectrum altogether. What should be India's approach vis-a-vis this particular aspect?
Well, I think it's a very pertinent point that you raised, Saurabh. And just to add to what Probal said, that the 59 apps by themselves may not represent a major move, but the Chinese have already calculated that it is a potential loss of $6 billion to them. So, the bite is coming in. Yesterday's Global Times also carried an article saying roughly, as you mentioned, what the Chinese ambassador here has said, that we should not allow, all this to cast a shadow on the other aspects of the relationship, and in fact, a very mellowed tone. So I think the bite is coming in. They're beginning to realize that this government is now going to start acting. what you mentioned about data is a very big business. It's got a huge potential, and the fact that a couple of our companies have already started setting up data hubs. I think it was Mahindra who set it up recently. That's a big move by us. If that takes on, firstly, China will probably be out of a slice of a huge market here for data. Secondly, it will hamper China's military ambitions because they have started applying artificial intelligence in a big way to military. And as you know, data is essential for artificial intelligence, for fine-tuning it into looking at various ethnic groups, etc., and to anticipate their moves. So I think this is going to be a big setback, along with, of course, the anticipated moves by India to block in course of time Chinese applications like Alibaba, Paytm, etc., coming in here, which I think will happen as we move ahead.
Coming to you, Professor Mattoo, you have been a big votary of Quad. Today, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talked about it also. Do you think time has come now that we need to move beyond the defense exercises that have been happening, the strategic exchanges? Time is there ripe to maybe have a defense pact of sorts to contain the rise of China and a rise of belligerent China between Australia, US, Japan, and India?
I think you need to have these de jure pacts publicly announced only at the final stages. What you need to do is to try and ensure that there is interoperability, that there is shared intelligence, including real-time intelligence. If the Five Eyes share that with you, I think it's going to be difficult. But there is the Malabar exercises, there's exercises that India and Australia have had. So there are all sorts of ways in which you can build coordination. Also coordination in multilateral forums. There's clearly a need. But let us also recognize that the challenge from China is enormous. And that someone must be held accountable, not the agencies, not the MEA necessarily, but that it has happened while we were aware that China was growing. After all over Asia, for most countries, the largest trading partner is China. How did we arrive at this? Now, given, Saurabh, the fact that you have such degree of trade dependence on China even today, are you forgetting there are going to be lobbies and lobbyists within China working, within India working for China? Isn't it time that we actually identify them and expose them as well? How, after all, this cannot have happened in a political vacuum, economic vacuum. The fact that all our manufacturing is almost completely finished is because of China. You go to Muradabad, you go to Firozabad, you go to anything. I mean, you go to any of the wholesale markets in Old Delhi. You can't find a product. You can't find a chandelier. You can't find a Ganesh, which is not made in China. From our religious symbols to our more profane items of daily use, all of it is dependent on China. So it's glad this is a wake-up call. In fact, the greatest favor that Xi Jinping has done is that announce his arrival in this belligerent fashion, because this has shaken us out of our complacency. But make no mistake, the challenge is far, far greater than all of us could have ever imagined.
I'm glad you said that. And just sort of before, just a quick one, because we're also running out of time. I would like, in the last segment, each one of you, Saurabh can come to you, give us a prescription, give us a lot of young viewers are watching you today, millions of our viewers. They want to know in quick 30 seconds, what are the three things that you would want government of India and some of these axes of democracies to do to actually contain China? Let's start with you, Probal.
Yeah. So one of the things that we need to understand is the larger Chinese strategy behind all these actions that we are seeing of becoming a great rejuvenated nation by 2049. So the three things that I would think that the nations should do, and India should lead this in this region, is the fact that recognize these Chinese actions, whether it is Southeast Asia, whether it is in Galwan or with various nations, as elements of a larger grand plan. Unless we realize that, we would only be responding to these Chinese aggressions tactically. So that's the first thing. Second, I think it is important to galvanize some of these plans into action, whether it is D10, whether it is the Quad or Quad Plus, or whether it is getting the allies together in terms of pushing China post-corona. That's number two. Number three, and this is specifically for India, and I would think, though India may not want to confront China or directly so, but I think India is in a position, if India wants to play a greater role in the neighborhood or in the region, this is the time when India needs to play to its strengths, take the dragon to the oceans, ask questions in terms of Hong Kong, in terms of Taiwan, in terms of the various other issues where China has upended the UNCLOS decisions of the International Court of Justice. So I think this is the time that India should push China on those areas where China is weak. And India has the backing of several allies to do that. And I think this is the time when India needs to play a larger role if it has to seize the initiative. Seizing the initiative is the key as far as I'm concerned.
Right. So, Probal, you're saying that the scales are in a way tilted in India's favor for now, and India has to make the most of this moment. Professor Mattoo, if I could just come to you, while you enumerate your 3 points, I would also quickly want your perspective on the statement, the 5 points that the Chinese ambassador has touched upon, where he says that we should be partners rather than rivals. He says we need to pursue win-win cooperation instead of zero-sum game. He says we need to build trust rather than suspicion, and relations should now move forward rather than backward. We need peace rather than confrontation. Has China now realized finally that it's up against a formidable power like India?
First of all, my prescription, it's called the ABCD. A is retain as much autonomy because you want to be ultimately not a junior partner, but you want to be an equal player in the international system as China or the United States, not now, maybe 20 years from now. So autonomy. B, broaden the coalition, the Quad plus, include like-minded partners like Singapore and Vietnam within this larger coalition. C, confront China when it challenges your core interests, as you have done in Galwan or in Pangong So. And D, continue with the dialogue. Never stop talking. That is the ABCD. As far as the Chinese ambassador goes, my simple thing is these are diplomatic niceties. You trust the Chinese ambassador for what he says at face value, but verify what actually happens. Intentions, good intentions can never be a substitute for hard-headed, cold analysis based on capabilities on the ground.
Absolutely. Mr. Ranade, you are someone, obviously, you don't believe in much of diplomacy. What are your ABCD, or what is your prescription? How do we deal with the belligerent China?
Saurabh, I believe in diplomacy when I'm posted in places where I have to keep a pretense temporarily. But let me just say, the 3 quick points. Before I start, let me say I agree with Dr. Mattoo that as far as the Chinese ambassador is concerned and what he said, it's a little more of the same Chinese formula of deceit and deception. But coming to the 3 quick points, I'll say first, our government has to get its own house in order and speak with one voice as far as China is concerned. We cannot have a situation where, like today, you have one arm of the government, I can name them if you like, one arm of the government which is going ahead and signing deals with the Chinese in sectors which we have disallowed as a government. Second, you have other parts of the government which are short of...
Please go ahead and name, sir. Please go ahead and name, we have
like a few years ago, we had Niti Aayog, or we have the railways, or we have the public sector undertakings going ahead and concluding deals with the Chinese companies. I think that needs to stop. Probably it will stop now. Yes. Similarly, when we are talking about China, we are stopping short of calling it an enemy. We cannot continue with this kind of thing. Secondly, we must start squeezing the space available to China within India, the space which they're exploiting by, I think someone mentioned it, creating lobbies here. That comes naturally as they expand their business. But there are lobbies operating here which are pushing for greater engagement, greater cooperation, 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 grea greater cooperation, etc. with China. And subsidiary to that are the lobbies being created by the Chinese in our academic, journalist, etc. sectors, where there are voices which speak out for the Chinese and push their agenda. Molding of young minds. These are the areas where we have to squeeze the space and not allow the Chinese to operate freely. That is, of course, something we have to do on our own. The second, I would say, is forge strong relationships, solid relationships with countries which have a common interest. We should not expect that they will share all our interests, but at least as far as China is concerned, we should have a strong convergence and go ahead, which is why I put a little question mark on Quad till we start seeing all the countries really committed and willing to sacrifice their economic interests with China, because that will be a stumbling block. At the same time, we should use these these relationships that we are building it to get markets for our products in those countries. Now, the United States and Europe are going to shut off their markets. They already plan to shut off about 70% to the Chinese. We will, I'm certain, find a space in them if we are able to match up as far as quality is concerned and with our relationship. And the third, I think India needs to drop its policy of the last 60 to 70 years of hesitancy. I find signs of that even today, including from former colleagues who say that we shouldn't push for this because it won't come through, or let's not say this because the Chinese will get upset. I refer to two things straight away. One is to Tibet. Let's be more open about it. He's already here. He's been here for so many years. Acknowledge the fact that he's here. Let him share a dais in a public space. It doesn't matter. Similarly with Taiwan. I'm not saying establish diplomatic relations, but there are a lot of technical stuff we can get from them, which will help us. Because as we start developing cyber hardware capability, we will harden our cyber firewalls against Chinese attacks. So these are three quick points that I'm making.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. And it's very clear. Thank you, Professor Mattoo, Mr. Ranade, Probal, Saurabh. And one thing before I wind up is very clear that China is a neighbor. It's not a friend. We have to manage China, as you said. But clearly, we will require to have a sustained policy when it comes to China. I think your views today will have a greater clarity amongst especially some of our young viewers who are watching us today on how to deal with a belligerent China. Thanks for watching NewsMobile. Stay tuned to our continuing coverage on the China issue and issues that impact you. Thanks for watching.